You are Locked On Wolverines, your daily podcast on the Michigan Wolverines, part of the Locked On Podcast Network.
Happy Friday. We are 15 days away from Michigan's incursion into the college football playoff. Locked On Wolverines podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it is your team every day. I am your man on the ground, Isaiah Hole, publisher of Wolverines Wire through USA Today Sports Media Group. I have Zuri joining me, kind of. If you're watching, she is just out of frame, demanding attention. If you're listening, just know that she is there. That's mostly for you, Jimmy Whitner. But we had a couple media availabilities with Michigan players. I guess there are some things to take away from that. There's been some transfer stuff that has happened. There's been a commitment. We're going to kind of do a touch them all. We're going to try to keep this one short and sweet in general. But let's just dig in to the first, before we even get to the media availability stuff, of which I have basically one big takeaway, which I've written about already. We'll get to that momentarily. But before we do, let's discuss this newest commitment, and that is via, not the newest commitment, because that would be a 2025 prospect. And as much as I want to talk about Chris Ewald, well, I don't actually, because 2025 is a very long ways away. I do want to talk about Ernest Hausman, the Nebraska linebacker, who was originally a 3-star, but 24/7 Sports released their transfer rankings as far as the transfer portal. At number 1 in the country is Ernest Hausman, former Nebraska linebacker. Pretty incredible. Michigan's got the number 1 and the number 11. They are number 2 in the team rankings, according to 24/7 Sports at the moment. They're in it for number 3, Fentrell Cypress from Virginia. They're in it for a couple other guys who are ranked: Tony Grimes, Josiah, whatever his last name is. For some reason, I can't remember it. They are in it still for quite a few. And this is where things can kind of get interesting, right? Is because suddenly, you're not just getting guys that essentially are commitments. You're getting guys that are commitments that can play right away and can help your team win. Obviously worked out really well with the 2 of the 3 transfers that Michigan reeled in this year, but in Olu as well as Ayabioki. Cam Good, he's gotten a little bit of playing time, but nothing really crazy. So if Michigan can keep doing that, that sets them up pretty well. And actually, that's where I want to bring the conversation, because I had a conversation with my best friend earlier today, and I think this is pertinent. This is where it is also kind of echoes the mailbag question from yesterday: is Michigan, is it a dynasty? And I say not yet. But this is where the importance of doing well in the playoff can pay big dividends, right? Because if you lose in the first round, again, you become Oklahoma or Notre Dame. You become like a team that's like, okay, you can get that far, but you're probably not going to win beyond that, and that's not good. Given Michigan's path to the national championship game and getting to play against TCU of all teams, I mean, that's not as easy of a draw per se as like a Cincinnati team, but that's certainly easier than Georgia or Alabama or one of those types of teams. The teams that actually end up playing in the national championship, if you kind of go back and think about it, they're all relevant programs. Even the ones that maybe fell off, like Oregon, we still think of Oregon as being a highly relevant program. For the ones who didn't, Florida State in 2014, we don't think of them very much of anything, right? We don't think very much about Washington. We don't think very much about Notre Dame or Oklahoma or any of those teams that just kind of, we talk about Notre Dame and Oklahoma a lot, obviously, collectively as a college football media, but and they're widely seen as very good, but not really as a team that can win it all. Once you win it all, everything opens up for you. I would even argue that just by virtue of making the college football playoff for a second straight year, it's starting to do that for Michigan. And if you can do that if you can go and you can win a national championship, which is going to be easier said than done because Georgia is an absolute beast, but suddenly everything changes. Now, last year, of course, we were talking about Georgia widely as the best team in college football. Obviously, maybe here on Locked On Wolverines, we took a little bit of a step back because suddenly we get blinded by the matchup. But, I mean, generally, that's how Georgia had been looked at, and then they won the whole thing. But before that, before Georgia became the team it became, they were looked at in the same kind of light as Clemson. Before Clemson became a thing. You know, Clemsoning was a big, it was the type of thing where, all right, Clemson's in a position to win. How do they screw it up? So Michigan has an opportunity to cement itself as a power, like a true power, to be mentioned in the same breath as Georgia, Alabama, Ohio State. There's very few outliers. LSU was kind of an outlier, given that it was just the kind of one incursion and then done. But I mean, obviously, that was an incredible team. But outside of that, generally, we have seen pretty much every team that's made it to the championship game has been thought of as being one of the elite of the elite. If Michigan can do that, that not only sets you up in recruiting, that also sets you up with transfers. That sets you up with maybe even more favorable NIL opportunities because as more businesses and investors, donors, boosters want to get involved. And ultimately, what that really does is it just puts your team on a pedestal, and then the next step is from there. Weakening Ohio State even more. It's a little more difficult this year because they are in the playoff. But we're going to completely left turn this because these are just thoughts that I had earlier in the day, and I feel like it's a good place to share. And then we'll get into the press conference takeaway. Since there really was only one big one between the 2 days, we'll get to that momentarily. Before we even get to any of that, listen, betonline.net is your number one source for sports betting info, stats, news, and analysis. Get the latest odds and trends for every professional and amateur league out there. From pro football to college bowl season to basketball and World Cup, we've got it all at betonline.net. If you love sports podcasts, you can even find those at BetOnline as well. We're always the fastest and easiest way to get your betting info. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more. BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, like I said, we are doing this short and sweet today. We are on a 5-day a week, even though there hasn't been a lot of new developments. Certainly next week there will be to some degree because we got early signing day, and we'll see if Michigan can close with any number of these players that we have talked about before, as well as guys like Carmelo English, and does Michigan get any surprise guys, that type of thing. But that's the thing is, if Michigan can advance to the national championship game, suddenly you are looked at in a different light because different players across college football, they might forego some NIL opportunities if they see like, hey, yeah, that program right over there, that gets me an opportunity to play for it all. And then it increases NIL opportunities because then you're even more in the spotlight. You get experiences you wouldn't get otherwise. And you set yourself up as a team that is going to ultimately be that big successful team. Clemson, like I said, was Clemsoning. And then they start getting to the playoffs. It was Florida State for a couple of years that was looked at as being the dominant ACC program. And then Clemson kind of comes along and knocks Florida State out. And Florida State stayed relevant for a couple of years until DeAndre Francois' injury to begin the 2017 season, and then it fell off a cliff until this year. Now, Ohio State isn't going to really fall off a cliff. That's not going to happen, right? But this is the opportunity right now if you're Michigan. And it starts this year, but it's a multiple year scenario. Ohio State is clearly still recruiting extremely well. They just got Jeremiah Smith out of Opelika, Florida, 5-star receiver, and from the 2024 class. They're still recruiting extremely well, particularly at the skill positions. It hasn't mattered the last 2 years. They've had the most talented skill position players that Michigan's seen from any team in the last 2 years, and Michigan still won by 15 and 22. So Michigan needs to keep doing what it's doing. It needs to win a national championship, because then it has a bargaining chip that very few teams have that allow you to take that next step forward. 2014, for instance, for Ohio State was very good in the first couple of years of Urban Meyer, but they weren't this machine that they eventually became, even though they didn't really have much to show for it. But they became the machine in large part, I think, because they managed to get hot at the right time without necessarily having an insanely dominant team across the board. Now, they certainly were insanely dominant in the trenches, which is the important part. That's what Michigan is doing right now, too. That's what Georgia is doing. And that allowed them to kind of expand their board. Unfortunately, they kind of went way too far, and their eyes got a little wide at, oh, we can get all the top 5-star receivers. Oh, yeah, we want that. But it's come at a sacrifice, because when you aren't playing complementary football, things can fall apart. And we've seen that, not just with Ohio State. We've seen it with other teams that tend to be really good. Look at Tennessee against Georgia, right? Like, okay, that offense looks great, and you might be able to beat certain teams that way. But then if you get a certain team that plays a different way, like Georgia or Michigan, then suddenly that kind of falls apart, because you just don't have the lines to withstand that. You can move the ball, but you can't finish unless you hit a home run on every play. But you're like Michigan against Ohio State, you're playing smart and you're holding everybody in front of you. So the next step for Michigan, it needs to get to the championship game. Ideally win it, but being close, making it a huge battle would probably be enough. Because then when you look at what Michigan's roster is, it looks pretty dang good going into next year. Whereas Ohio State's going to, again, have a lot of turnover, particularly at the quarterback position. Games at home. You think about the schedule, the tough road games or MSU, I think Michigan will be certainly motivated in that game. Penn State, Michigan's done pretty well going to Penn State for the most part. If you can go 11-1 or 12-0 with an Ohio State win in there again, get back to the college football playoff. Not only are you, because in today's college football, Ryan Day probably doesn't get the John Cooper treatment. He probably doesn't get a long-term, you figure it out type scenario. He'd probably be gone at that point. And then, if you're Ohio State, who are you going to go get? This is a program that falls upwards quite a lot. And they probably can. This is one of the things my best friend said, so I'm not going to take credit for this, but he said, you probably can't go and get an unknown like Jim Tressel nowadays if you're Ohio State. You just can't do it. Then they're starting to chase. Win one more. Get back to the playoff. Especially if you can win a championship, get to the national championship game, one or the other. Now you are in a position where you have firm control of the conference. That's how things make a permanent flip. And it would start with, again, the national championship game. So it is important that Michigan finds a way to get there, which I think pretty much everyone's going to predict that will happen. Obviously, the reason why games are played, however, TCU comes out and plays a perfect game. Michigan doesn't. We are talking about Michigan is Oklahoma, Jim Harbaugh's bowl record, blah, blah, blah. Michigan has an opportunity, though, because once there's a little blood in the water with the team that is perceived as the best in the conference, as long as Alabama is not in your conference, generally, you're probably going to have a shot to just kind of come in and take things over. LSU had that opportunity and they lost it because they had no team outside of 2019. Alabama came roaring back, won a championship, but Georgia seized control. Right now, we are talking more about Georgia than we are Alabama. We talk more about Clemson than we talk about Florida State. Michigan has a similar opportunity. It's just looking from the grand big picture. You do that, suddenly, especially if you just make it to that championship game, if you can put up a fight, you can win it. There will be guys that are sitting back that had no interest in your program before that might otherwise be looking for a handout somewhere else that's suddenly saying, that's what I want. And it might not be immediate. 2024, 2025, especially 26 and 27, that's when things start to really pick up. Because it has short-term consequences as well as long-term implications. So if I'm Michigan, I'm doing everything in my power to get it done this year. Not just because you don't know when you're going to be back. You never know what the circumstances are going to be. But because in the midst of this changing college football landscape, and it is going to certainly change a lot more with the expanded playoff, you are giving yourself so much more ripcord to play with than you had otherwise. All right, let's talk about the press conference thing for just a moment. Just my big takeaway. I don't think it's going to be anything completely revelatory, but it is my big takeaway, although it was somewhat contradicted today. Anyhow, listen, you're hanging out with some friends, putting back a few drinks. A few becomes too many. As the evening comes to an end and people start to head out, you start to think of calling for a ride, but no, you live nearby. You can make it home okay. It's no big deal. What are the odds that you get pulled over anyway? And even so, what's the worst that can happen? Your insurance goes up. You lose your license. You lose your job. You total your car. You kill someone. Everyone knows the risks of driving drunk. The results are tragic and often deadly. However, that still doesn't stop everyone from getting behind the wheel while under the influence. That's why police officers are out there right now looking for impaired drivers on our roads to save lives. So if you think you're okay to drive after a few drinks, think again, play it safe, and plan ahead to get a ride. It only takes one mistake to change your life or someone else's forever. So drive sober and get pulled over. That was fun because I'm like, drive sober and get pulled over. Like, that probably doesn't make any sense. All right. Anyway, we're just going to keep, like I said, we're going to keep this short and sweet today. Do want to get into the thing that was my biggest takeaway from the press conference stuff. And that is the things that were said by a couple people. And I asked both Trevor Keegan and Michael Barrett about the difference between last year and this year getting into the college football playoff. They both had a similar answer of some of us were just happy to be there. Now we aren't. We have higher expectations. We know what it's going to take. The distractions that come with that week aren't going to affect us the way they did before. And that was kind of what I expected. Now, like I said, it got contradicted a little bit. DJ Turner today. I feel like it's some guys are going to say, kind of give you, I think that's more truthful what Barrett and Keegan said. Someone like DJ Turner, I feel like, is always going to say, it's like, win or lose. Like, were you surprised? No, I wasn't surprised. You know what I mean? Like, he's always going to have that kind of, were you prepared? Yeah, we were prepared. You lost 62-0. Yeah, we were prepared. Type of thing. Like, that's obviously hypothetical, but I think that's just kind of how he's wired. But I do think that is a realistic thing, right? Because the highs from beating Ohio State and winning the Big Ten, given what everyone kind of expected or anticipated and all of that, I don't think anyone really thought that was going to happen last year. And even though maybe inside the program they did, I think that it was just such a, I think the mission was those two games, So whatever they got in the college football playoff was gravy. Now, it's not like they didn't prepare. It wasn't like that they didn't go out there and play, and Georgia was the national champion, and they were the best team in college football last year and were dominating everybody except for Alabama in the SEC championship game. But then they went back and did it in the championship game, you know. So, I mean, there is some credence to what DJ Turner said, but I do think that there was kind of a, wow, this is where we're at. Cool. This is cool, you know, type of thing. Didn't expect this at the beginning of the year type thing. And now I don't think that's the case at all for this team. And I do think that that is going to be the case to some degree for TCU. And I do think that that's, you know, like they say, you know, act like you've been here before. I do think that sometimes that does make a difference. And I think it will make a difference for Michigan. How big of a difference? I mean, probably enough to withstand any early jitters and anything to withstand any early storm and, you know, the scripted plays that TCU throws out, not having any kind of panic, being able to just kind of go out there and be methodical and do your thing, all that kind of stuff. I think that's where that can play a really big factor. Of course, there's multiple things that will. Michigan's better in the trenches. Michigan's offense should match up really well against the TCU defense. We'll see how the Michigan defense handles the TCU offense. It's the best defense they've seen all year. All that kind of stuff, right? But I do think that that is an important factor. And I think it's the same thing. It's kind of along the same lines as if you're a Michigan player versus being an Ohio State player. It's going into the game knowing and expecting to win. Knowing what it's like and expecting to win is different than a player going in and hoping you can win. Because I think that's where Ohio, kind of go back to my last two segments. For Ohio State, I think that they're getting dangerously close to hoping they can beat Michigan, whereas Michigan is expecting to, whereas the greater part of from Trussell forward, Michigan was hoping it could win rather than expecting to. So it really changes the culture of things, I think, from a macro standpoint. All right, that's going to do it for us today. Like I said, we're keeping it short and sweet today. We will be back on Monday. Have no plan as of yet, but Tuesday, supposedly we're getting a giant guest, arguably the biggest guest we have ever had on the podcast, if all goes to plan. And keeping in mind that we have had Joel Klatt on this podcast multiple times. So we'll see if that pans out. Anyway, thank you for watching and or listening. We will talk to you again soon. Peace.